Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. In the 8th month of the war between Ukraine and Russia, Russia is experiencing the most terrible, the darkest days in its history. Ukraine, on the other hand, continues its resolute progress, unlike Russia. Especially after the Russian leader Vladimir Putin announced the decision of partial mobilization, things started to get confused and reversed in Russia. At the beginning of the Ukrainian war, the Russians continued their dominant policies, and now they keep their position of retreat by keeping their precaution. Russian President Vladimir Putin is having a hard time controlling the Russian army and country. The effects of Russian dictator Putin's partial mobilization decision are causing Russia to be shaken. Russian leader Vladimir Putin's declaration of mobilization plunged people living in Russia into a flood of fear and panic. Some Russians flocked to the borders, risking leaving their country. The atmosphere of fear and panic in Russia gave way to riots and protests. While the anger of the Russian local people turned into a terrible torment for Putin, the echoes of the protests began to be heard in many cities. Note that Putin announced the partial mobilization to the people. It was the Russian leader himself who assured the Russians that only those who were supposedly in reserve and had the necessary expertise would be sent to the front. In a statement, the president of Russia mentioned that citizens with military specialties who previously served in the reserve will be summoned. Before being sent to Ukraine, additional military training was announced. At the same time, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced that Russia will call 300,000 reservists. However, in the declaration of mobilization, it is quite easy to estimate that the number of soldiers mobilized will reach millions. The secret clause of the mobilization decree refers to the possibility of sending 1 million Russians to war. Russian airlines and Russian pilots had their share of the so-called partial mobilization announcement by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Pilots are rebelling in the Russian Air Force and Russian airlines, and 2 Russian pilots rebelled and destroyed their own planes the other day. Bad events continue to follow Putin, who has lost his power and prestige both nationally and globally. The Russian Air Force demilitarized 2 of its aircraft in the Rostov region. In one day in Russia, 2 planes crashed at the same time. On October 9, in the Rostov region, the so-called VKS Su-24M bomber of the Russian Federation was found to be in heavy turbulence in the air, and at about 11 o'clock the plane lost altitude and crashed to the ground. It was noted that the aircraft did not carry weapons and allegedly made a training flight. It was learned that the pilots from the plane that crashed in Rostov managed to jump, but the pilots who managed to jump did not survive. The cause of the accident was transferred to the agenda as technical failure. At the same time, it became known that the day before, the VKS of the Russian Federation lost not only the Su-24M bomber but also the Su-25 attack aircraft. It is really a curious issue whether the reason for the crashes of the planes in Rostov is technical failure, but the authorities do not explain further on this issue. We will wait and see if the veil of secrecy and the cloud of suspicion behind the event will dissipate in the coming days. Also, the other day, the Russian Air Force once again disgraced Putin and Russia. Successful operations of the Ukrainian armed forces destroyed 2 Ka-52 Crocodile attack helicopters in half an hour, and 3 Russian Ka-52 helicopters and 1 Su-24 jet were destroyed in one day. Last week, the Ukrainian Air Force broke a record by shooting down 4 Russian Ka-52 helicopters in 18 minutes. This was clearly a massacre of Russian aviation. The incredible failure of Putin's pilots made Russian air dominance over Ukraine impossible. Currently, the Ukrainian armed forces is showing a 60% to 70% success against Russian aircraft and missiles with its powerful Western air defense systems. But the Ukrainian army needs much more advanced air defense systems, because the target of Russia's airstrikes in Ukraine at the moment seems to be only civilians and civilian infrastructure. This Russia is clearly considered a war strategy, and attacking civilian infrastructure is considered genocide given the approaching winter. Russian pilots were forcibly included among those affected by Russian President Putin's declaration of mobilization. The wind of Putin's deadly plans blew over Russian airlines. Despite the demands of the airlines, Russian pilots began to be recruited en masse. Employees of more than 10 airports, as well as at least 5 Russian airlines, including Aeroflot, were summoned to military registration and enlistment offices following the partial mobilization announcement. The majority of pilots in civil aviation are reserve officers trained in the military departments of flight schools or privates with military service behind them. Thus, we estimate that up to 80% of all Russian pilots could be sent to the war in Ukraine. It was previously reported that Russian airlines will start flying with a single pilot to save money. In addition, it is possible to say that the Russian airline Aeroflot will have a shortage of spare parts of Boeing and Airbus in near future due to the sanctions. Pilots of regional Russian airlines will be instructed to maintain their own aircraft under the sanctions imposed on the country following the invasion of Ukraine. Oleg Bocharov, Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade of Russia, in a speech on the accessibility of the Far East to air transport in conditions of turbulence, said the following. Oleg Bocharov said that, together with the Ministry of Transport, we must train and certify pilots as universal fighters. Pilots must be pilots and aircraft technicians at the same time. Pilots must ensure the possibility of field repairs in equipment and operation. To maintain the airworthiness of new types of local regional aircraft, we're talking primarily about regional aviation pilots for whom a fundamentally new system should be created. The Russian aviation industry has been heavily impacted by Western sanctions imposed after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24. Russian airlines were banned from the airspace of the US, European Union, UK, and Canada after the invasion. In retaliation, Moscow banned EU and Canadian airlines from leaving its territory. Russia's flagship Aeroflot has temporarily suspended all international flights outside of Belarus. The EU also added 21 Russian airlines to its air safety list in April, preventing them from operating on its territory on security grounds. EU Transport Commissioner Adina Valean said that this has nothing to do with the occupation of Ukraine and will live in the context of Russia's unreasonable and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine. Western sanctions have also undermined Russian airlines' ability to protect their existing aircraft. We learned that Aeroflot has begun dismantling some of its aircraft after leaving Western equipment and service. It is possible to say that a nearly new Airbus A350 has been disassembled for parts, and equipment has also been removed for a number of Aeroflot Boeing 737s and Airbus 320s to keep other aircraft in flight condition. It has been learned that 50 of Aeroflot's 360 aircraft have not yet taken off since July. According to Kiev, the Russian administration has lost some of the most advanced warplanes in Ukraine, and the Russians are replacing them with outdated warplanes. Due to Russia's unjust invasion of Ukraine, the West turned its back on Putin and imposed a series of sanctions. These problems between Russian pilots, Russian Air Force, and Russian aviation seem impossible to solve in short term, and Russian pilots continue to humiliate Putin. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel to be notified of new videos. Thank you for watching us.